I remember that night like it was yesterday. The hospital was unusually quiet, a silence that seemed almost unnatural for a place that's normally bustling with life or death. It was the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the kind that makes you feel like something's just not right. My shift started like any other, clocking in at DT. Mary's Hospital in Ravenswood, a town so small that everyone knew everyone's business. But that night, something was different, something that would change my life forever. It wasn't long before the eerie atmosphere got to me. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant beep from a monitor, seemed louder than it should have been. I was used to the sounds of the hospital, but this was different. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to brush it off as just another quiet night, but deep down, I knew better. I could feel it in my gut that something was coming, something I wasn't prepared for. Then, just past midnight, the doors to the ER flew open, and they wheeled in a patient on a gurney. The guy was a mess, his body covered in deep, jagged scars that looked like they were carved into his flesh with something far from human. His clothes were torn, and his face was something I'll never forget. It was twisted in pain, his eyes wild with a fear that chilled me to the bone. He was muttering something under his breath, words that didn't make any sense, like a language I'd never heard before. As I got closer to him, the muttering grew louder, more frantic. The other nurses were trying to get him stabilized, but he wasn't responding to anything we did. It was like he was trapped in his own world, a world of terror that none of us could reach. I reached out to check his pulse, and that's when it happened. His hand shot out and grabbed my arm with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone in his condition. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as his grip tightened. He looked right into my eyes, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. It was just me and him, locked in that terrifying moment. His eyes were filled with something I can only describe as desperation, like he was trying to warn me about something that was coming for both of us. And then, in a voice that sounded like it came from the depths of hell itself, he whispered, "He is coming." Those words sent a chill down my spine, a chill that hasn't left me since. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. His grip loosened, and he slumped back onto the gurney, unconscious. The other nurses rushed to take over, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Those 3 words kept echoing in my head, over and over, like a dark omen that I couldn't escape. I knew, deep down, that whatever he was talking about wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was coming. The days that followed were anything but normal. At first, it was little things I could almost convince myself were just in my head. I'd set my keys down in one place, only to find them somewhere else minutes later. The lights in my apartment would flicker for no reason, and every now and then I'd hear faint whispers, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was just stress, but the truth is, I was scared. I'd never felt anything like it before, this creeping sense of dread that seemed to follow me everywhere. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences escalated. One night, I was sitting on my couch, trying to relax with a book, when I saw it a shadow, just at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it slithered along the wall, creeping closer to me. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it, unable to look away. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, reaching out for me. I bolted up, turning on every light in the apartment, but the shadow was gone. Still, the feeling lingered, that cold, oppressive sensation that something was there watching. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd feel it something standing at the foot of my bed, just out of sight. I'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, but there was never anything there. The nights stretched on, each one worse than the last. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like voices just beyond a door that I couldn't open. And then there were the shadows always lurking, always just out of reach. I could feel them in the corners of my vision, dark and menacing, but they'd vanish the moment I tried to focus on them. I started avoiding the hospital as much as I could, taking every excuse to stay away. But even that didn't help. The feeling of being watched followed me everywhere, from my apartment to the streets of Ravenswood. I'd catch glimpses of that same shadow in the reflections of shop windows, in the dark alleys I passed by. It was like whatever had attached itself to that patient was now attached to me, a constant, unseen presence that wouldn't let go. My mind was a mess, and the worst part was, I had no idea what it wanted or how to make it stop. One evening, as I was locking up the apartment, I heard its footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty hallway outside my door. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and then nothing. Silence. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest, but no one knocked, no one called out. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to open the door, but the hallway was empty. Still, I knew what I had heard. It wasn't my imagination, and it sure as hell wasn't a coincidence. By now, I was barely holding it together. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening wasn't just random, it was targeted, deliberate. It was as if that patient's warning was coming to life, step by terrifying step. The unease that had started as a whisper was now a scream, a relentless, gnawing fear that something terrible was just around the corner. And the worst part, I had no idea what to do about it. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next scare. But even as I tried to figure out my next move, something inside me knew that the worst was yet to come. The whispers, the shadows, the footsteps, they were all just the beginning. Whatever was coming, it wasn't going to stop until it had me. And so I waited, bracing myself for the moment when it would finally make its move. The nightmares started soon after. At first, they were just fragments, flashes of dark corridors and shadowy figures, but they quickly grew more vivid, more terrifying. I'd find myself back in the hospital, but it was different, decayed, crumbling, like it had been abandoned for years. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Every step I took echoed in the empty halls, and I could feel them eyes watching me, following me, but I could never see who or what they belonged to. Each night, the dreams would pick up where the last one left off, like some twisted story unfolding in my sleep. The hospital was filled with patients, but they weren't alive. They were trapped, tortured souls, their bodies mangled and broken. They'd reach out to me, their fingers twisted and claw-like, begging for help that I couldn't give. The terror was so real, so overwhelming, that I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. And yet, the worst part wasn't the nightmares themselves, it was the marks they left on me. I started noticing them one morning after a particularly bad dream. I had been chased through the hospital by something I couldn't see, only to wake up with scratches down my arms. They were shallow, but real red and raw, like I'd been clawed at by something desperate to hold on. It didn't make any sense. How could something from a dream leave a mark on me in the real world? But there they were, undeniable proof that whatever was happening wasn't just in my head. As the days went on, the line between dream and reality began to blur. I'd see the hospital in places it shouldn't be, walking down the street. I'd catch a glimpse of those decaying walls out of the corner of my eye, only for it to vanish when I turned to look. It was like the dreams were bleeding into my waking life, pulling me back into that nightmarish world even when I was awake. And always in the background, I could hear them, the tortured souls, crying out for help, begging me to do something, anything, to end their suffering. The patient's face started appearing everywhere, too. I'd see him in the most unexpected places, staring back at me from a reflection in a window, his eyes hollow and pleading. Or in the faces of strangers passing by, just for a split second before they returned to normal. It was driving me mad, this constant reminder of that night, of the words he'd spoken. He is coming. What did it mean? Why couldn't I escape it? It was like the universe was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't decipher the message. I tried to talk to someone about it, but how do you explain something like this without sounding insane? I even considered seeing a therapist, but every time I picked up the phone to make an appointment, something stopped me. A voice in my head, maybe, telling me that no one would believe me, that they'd lock me up if I told them the truth. So I kept it all inside, letting the fear fester, letting it consume me bit by bit. I felt more alone than I ever had before, like I was the only one standing between this world and something unspeakably evil. It was around this time that I realized the patient was trying to communicate with me through these visions, these nightmares. But the message was still unclear, shrouded in layers of horror and confusion. I knew I had to figure it out, though. I could feel it, and my bones' time was running out, and whatever was coming, it was getting closer. I needed to understand what he was trying to tell me before it was too late. I couldn't go on like this. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The first step was to find out who this patient really was. The hospital's records were the logical place to start, but when I looked into it, I hit a brick wall. There was no trace of him anywhere, no name, no ID, nothing. It was like he didn't exist. But I knew better. He was real, and he had left his mark on me in ways I couldn't ignore. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that this wasn't just some random occurrence. There was something much darker at play. Determined to uncover the truth, I started asking around, talking to people who had been in Ravenswood long before I arrived. Most of them dismissed me as some crazy guy with too much imagination, but there was one old man, Mr. Thompson, who seemed to know more than he was letting on. He told me about a place called Ravenswood Asylum, a name that sent a shiver down my spine the moment I heard it. The asylum had been shut down decades ago, buried under a mountain of scandals and horrors that the town preferred to forget. It wasn't easy getting information about the asylum. Most of it had been scrubbed from public records. But I managed to find a few articles, old, yellowed clippings from the town's newspaper, buried deep in the library's archives. The stories were horrifying tales of unethical experiments, patients who were more like prisoners, and doctors who dabbled in things that should never have been touched. One name kept coming up: John Doe. That was the patient's name, or rather, the name they gave him when they couldn't figure out who he really was. John Doe had been the subject of some of the worst experiments at Ravenswood Asylum, experiments that were supposed to unlock the secrets of the mind, but ended up opening doors to something far more sinister. As I read through the reports, my blood ran cold. The doctors had been trying to harness supernatural forces, forces they couldn't control. And John Doe, he was the key, the one who had somehow survived when all the others had died. But at what cost? It was clear that whatever had been done to him had changed him forever. With this new knowledge, I knew I had to go deeper. The asylum itself was long gone, but the hospital street, Mary's, had been built right over its ruins. That was no coincidence. I started searching the hospital, looking for any sign of the past, anything that could connect the dots between John Doe and the nightmare I was living. It wasn't until I ventured into the basement that I found it a hidden room, sealed off for years, untouched by time. The air was thick with dust and the stench of decay, and in the center of the room was a chair, stained with blood, surrounded by old, rusted equipment. My heart pounded in my chest as I took it all in. This was where it had happened, where they had tortured him, tried to break him, and in the process, unleashed something they couldn't control. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the stone, symbols that made my skin crawl just looking at them. And in the corner, I found a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. As I flipped through it, I saw the scrawled notes of a madman, one of the doctors, maybe detailing their experiments, their obsession with the supernatural, and the entity they had accidentally summoned. Everything pointed to one conclusion. John Doe hadn't just survived the experiments, he had become something more, something connected to that entity. And now that same entity was after me. I could feel it, creeping closer with every passing day. But I wasn't going to run. I couldn't. I had to face it, to stop whatever had started all those years ago, before it consumed me the way it had consumed him. The question was, how? How do you fight something that isn't entirely of this world? It all started making sense, or as much sense as something like this could make. The nightmares, the shadows, the whispers, they were all connected to this entity, this thing that the doctors at Ravenswood Asylum had tried to control, but couldn't. It wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was something much darker, much older. Something that fed on fear, on suffering, growing stronger with each moment of terror it created. And now it was coming for me, just as the patient had warned. I could feel its presence getting stronger, closer, with each passing day. The journal I found in that hidden room gave me the final piece of the puzzle. Buried in the mad scrawlings of a desperate man was the key to understanding what I was up against. The doctor had written about a ritual, something they had performed in a last-ditch effort to bind the entity to this world, to use its power for their own twisted purposes. But the ritual had gone horribly wrong. Instead of binding the entity, they had unleashed it, giving it a foothold in our reality. And John Doe, he had been the one chosen, or perhaps cursed, to be its vessel. As I read through the journal, I came across a passage that chilled me to the bone. It described the entity as a creature of shadows, feeding on the fear it created, growing stronger with every soul it consumed. And it had been patient, waiting for the right moment to fully cross over into our world. The ritual had weakened the barrier between our world and its, but it needed a vessel, someone marked by the ritual, to complete the crossing. That's why John Doe had been chosen. That's why he had come to me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was next. The patient's touch, his words, they weren't just a warning. They were a mark, a sign that the entity had chosen me to be its next vessel. The scratches, the nightmares, the feeling of being watched, it was all part of its plan, a way to wear me down, to make me more susceptible to its influence. But I wasn't going to go down without a fight. If this thing thought it could take me without a struggle, it had another thing coming. But fighting, it wasn't going to be easy. The entity was powerful, far more powerful than anything I had ever encountered. And it was smart too, using my own fears against me, turning my mind into a battleground where it could strike from the shadows. I knew I couldn't face it alone. I needed help, someone who understood the supernatural, who could guide me through this nightmare. But who could I turn to? The town was full of people who would think I was crazy if I told them the truth, and time was running out. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the answer might lie with the patient himself. He had been through this before, survived it for decades. If anyone knew how to fight this thing, it would be him. But he was gone, vanished without a trace after that night in the air. Or was he? I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to find him. And if I could find him, maybe I could find a way to stop this before it was too late. I knew what I had to do, and even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, I steeled myself for the confrontation ahead. There was no turning back now. The hospital, with its cold, sterile corridors and the faint smell of antiseptic, had never felt more like a battleground. The basement was my destination, the place where it all began, and where it would hopefully end. As I descended the creaking stairs, the air grew thick, almost suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, trying to keep me out, or maybe trying to keep something in. With each step, the shadows grew darker, the silence more oppressive. The only sound was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears, louder and louder as I approached the hidden room. The door was still there, just as I had left it, but now it felt like a barrier between me and the unknown. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but then I heard it a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It was the patient's voice, guiding me, urging me forward. I swallowed hard, pushed the door open, and stepped into the darkness. The room was exactly as I remembered it, old, decaying, with the same strange symbols carved into the walls. But this time, it felt different, alive with a malevolent energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The shadows moved on their own, twisting and writhing like living things, and in the center of it all stood a figure, barely visible in the gloom. It was the entity, the thing that had been haunting me, feeding on my fear. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and calculating, sizing me up as its next victim. The moment of truth had arrived. I was no longer just a nurse caught up in something beyond my understanding. I was a fighter, and this was a battle for my soul. The entity moved closer, the shadows growing thicker around it, distorting reality itself. The room seemed to warp and twist, the walls closing in, the floor shifting beneath my feet. I could feel it trying to get into my head, to break me down, to make me submit. But I wasn't going to let it win. I focused on the one thing I knew could weaken it. The ritual, the same one that had given it power, could also be its undoing. With the journal in hand, I began to chant the words, the same words the doctors had used all those years ago. My voice wavered at first, but as the entity recoiled, I grew stronger. The shadows hissed and writhed, but they couldn't reach me. The air grew colder, and the ground shook, but I kept going, my voice rising above the chaos. The entity howled in rage, its form flickering, becoming less substantial with each word I spoke. I could feel it weakening, its grip on our world slipping. But it wasn't giving up without a fight. The entity lunged at me, its shadowy tendrils reaching out, trying to drag me into the darkness. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but I held on, finishing the chant with every ounce of strength I had left. The room exploded with light, blinding and searing, and the entity let out a final, earth-shattering scream. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, as the light faded and the shadows dissolved. The entity was gone, banished back to whatever hell it had come from. I had won, or at least, that's what I told myself as I struggled to my feet, the room still spinning around me. But as I looked around at the destruction, the shattered remnants of the ritual, the burned symbols on the walls, I knew this wasn't over. The hospital might have been safe for now, but something told me the entity wasn't gone for good. It had been defeated, but not destroyed. And somewhere out there, in the darkness, it was waiting, biding its time, ready to strike again. The aftermath was as harrowing as the confrontation itself. The hospital basement, once a place of secrets and horrors, was now ruined, its walls scorched, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and something far more sinister. The equipment that had once been used in those unspeakable experiments lay in twisted heaps, and the symbols carved into the stone had been burned away, leaving only faint traces of their existence. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The entity was gone, but the cost of that victory was etched into every corner of that cursed room. I was physically and mentally drained, but there was no time to rest. As I made my way back up the stairs, Every step felt like it was dragging me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The hospital was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that comes after a storm. But even in that silence, I could feel it, the lingering presence of something dark, something that had left its mark on me in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. I was free, but not unscathed. The shadows that had haunted me were gone, but they had taken a part of me with them. Returning to my life was anything but easy. The events of that night played over and over in my mind, like a tape stuck on repeat. I couldn't sleep without seeing that figure in the shadows, couldn't walk down a hallway without feeling its eyes on me. The world felt different, darker, as if the entity had left a stain on everything it touched. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I had won, but deep down, I knew better. The battle was finished, but the war was far from over. The entity was still out there, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for its chance to return. The hospital was never the same either. People whispered about the explosion in the basement, about the strange lights and the sounds that had echoed through the halls that night. But no one could explain it, and the official reports glossed over the details, chalking it up to a freak accident. I let them believe that better that than the truth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that others could sense it too, that they knew something had changed, even if they didn't know what. The atmosphere at St. Mary's was thick with unease, a tension that never quite went away. As for me, I tried to move on, to put the pieces of my life back together. But it wasn't long before I started hearing it again, those whispers, faint at first, like echoes from a distant place. They would come at night, when the world was quiet and my mind was drifting. The words were different, but the message was the same. He is still coming. The patient's voice, as clear as it had been that first night, haunting me from beyond the grave. It was a reminder that the entity wasn't finished with me yet, that it was only a matter of time before it made its move. I couldn't live like that, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next nightmare to begin. But I also knew I couldn't escape it. The entity had marked me, claimed me as its own, and there was no outrunning that kind of darkness. So I prepared myself, steeling my mind against the fear, the doubt. Whatever came next, I would face it head on. I had survived once. I could survive again. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far worse. And so I wait. The hospital stands silent, its walls holding the secrets of what happened in that basement. The town of Ravenswood goes on, blissfully unaware of the darkness that lingers just out of sight. And I listen to the whispers, knowing that they are a warning, a harbinger of what is to come. The entity may have been banished, but it is not gone. It is waiting, watching, and when the time is right, it will return. And when it does, I'll be ready. I have to be. Because this time, it won't just be a battle for my soul, it will be a battle for everything.